The Arizona sun beat down on Colton Mercer's neck like a branding iron as he stood in Judge Harlan's chambers, dust still coating his boots from the morning ride into town. He'd come expecting trouble, a property dispute, maybe, or some complaint from a neighboring rancher, but nothing could have prepared him for what the old bastard was about to say. 30 days, Mercer. Judge Harlan's voice cut through the stale air of the room, cold and final as a funeral bell. You marry within 30 days, or I'm signing Iron Ridge Ranch over to the Territorial Development Company. Colton's jaw tightened until his teeth ached. On what grounds? Abandonment of community standards. Harlan shuffled papers on his desk without looking up, like this conversation bored him. You've owned that land for 10 years. No wife, no family, no contribution to the growth of this territory. The law is clear. Homesteads of that size require proper establishment of family units. That's horseshit, and you know it. Colton stepped forward, his voice dropping to something dangerous. I've built that ranch from nothing. Cleared every acre myself, ran off cattle thieves, survived droughts, paid every tax on time. You can't just... I can, and I will. Harlan finally met his eyes, and Colton saw something worse than cruelty there. Indifference. The development company's been eyeing your water rights for 2 years. They've got plans for that land, Mercer. Big plans. And they've got friends in the territorial government who agree that a stubborn bachelor sitting on prime ranch land isn't in the community's best interest. The room seemed to tilt. Colton had seen men lose everything before. To weather, to violence, to bad luck. But this was different. This was the law itself turning into just another weapon for the powerful to use against anyone in their way. So you're stealing my land. I'm encouraging you to fulfill your civic duty. Harlan leaned back in his chair, almost smiling now. Find a wife. Get married. Prove you're building something permanent. Do that, and the ranch stays yours. Simple as that. Nothing about this was simple, and they both knew it. Colton turned and walked out before he did something that would land him in a cell. The street outside was busy with the usual afternoon traffic, wagons rolling past, men loading supplies, women shopping with baskets over their arms. Normal life continuing while his was being ripped apart by legal theft dressed up as community standards. He needed a drink. Hell, he needed about 10 drinks. The Lucky Star Saloon was half empty when he pushed through the doors, which suited him fine. He wasn't in the mood for conversation. The bartender, a rail-thin man named Webb, who'd seen enough broken men to know when to keep his mouth shut, poured whiskey without asking. Colton downed the first shot and gestured for another. Heard you had a meeting with Harlan. Webb kept his voice low as he poured. That never goes well for anybody. He's trying to take Iron Ridge. Webb's hand paused halfway through wiping down the bar. On what grounds? I'm not married. Colton laughed, but there was no humor in it. Apparently that makes me unfit to own land. That's... Webb struggled to find words. I didn't know that was even a law. It's not. Not really. But when you've got money backing you, you can make up whatever laws you want. Colton downed the second shot and pushed the glass back for a third. 30 days to find a wife or lose everything. The saloon doors swung open and 3 men walked in, ranch hands from the Double J spread, loud and already half drunk from somewhere else. Colton ignored them, but their voices carried across the empty room anyway. You hear about Mercer? One of them said, too loud. Judge gave him a month to find a woman desperate enough to marry his sorry ass. Laughter followed, sharp and mean. 30 days ain't enough time, another voice chimed in. Hell, 30 years wouldn't be enough. Man's been alone so long he's forgotten how to talk to people like a human being. Colton's hand tightened around his glass. Webb caught his eye and gave a small shake of his head. Not worth it, but the rage building in Colton's chest didn't care about worth. I heard they're bringing in women from back east, the first man continued. Mail-order brides and spinsters nobody else wanted. Figure even Mercer might find one desperate enough to take his money. The glass shattered in Colton's hand. He didn't remember standing up, didn't remember crossing the room. But suddenly, he had the man by his shirt collar, slamming him back against the bar hard enough to rattle bottles. Say that again. Colton's voice came out quiet, deadly. The man's eyes went wide with the kind of fear that comes from realizing you've pushed something you shouldn't have. His friends reached for their guns, but Webb's shotgun cocking behind the bar stopped them cold. Gentlemen, Webb said calmly, I think you've had enough for one day. Time to go. Colton held the man there for another 3 seconds, long enough to make his point, then shoved him away. The three of them stumbled out cursing, throwing threats over their shoulders that everyone knew they wouldn't follow through on. The saloon fell silent again. You're bleeding. Webb nodded at Colton's hand, where glass had cut a line across his palm. Colton looked down at the blood like he'd only just noticed it. Yeah. You need to think about this smart, Mercer. Harlan's got the territorial government behind him. You can't fight this with your fists. Then what the hell am I supposed to fight it with? Colton's voice cracked despite himself. I've got nothing else. Webb pulled out a newspaper from under the bar, folded to show the classifieds. Maybe you fight it by doing exactly what they said. Find a wife. Not some society woman who'll expect you to be something you're not. Someone practical. Someone who needs what you're offering as much as you need what they're offering. Colton stared at the paper. Advertisements for mail-order brides. Women seeking honest employment or marriage to respectable landowners. It felt wrong, desperate, like admitting defeat before the fight even started. But losing the ranch felt worse. I'll think about it, he muttered, taking the paper. He rode back to Iron Ridge as the sun started its descent, painting the desert in shades of orange and red. The ranch spread out before him, the main house he'd built with his own hands, the barn he'd raised after the first one burned down, the corrals and outbuildings and miles of fence line representing 10 years of his life. Every scar on his body had a story connected to this land. Every callus on his hands came from making this place real. And now some judge and his corporate friends wanted to steal it because Colton had committed the crime of being alone. Inside the house, he lit a lamp and spread the newspaper across the kitchen table. The advertisements blurred together, women describing themselves in careful, desperate language. Hardworking. Practical. Seeking security. No longer young, but strong. He felt like a vulture picking over bones. 3 days later, he sent 2 letters. One went to a widow in Kansas who said she could cook, sew, and manage household accounts. The other went to a woman in Boston whose advertisement was different from the rest. Shorter, sharper, with none of the usual pleading tone. Educated woman seeks partnership with Western landowner. No illusions, no false promises. Equal respect required. Something about that last line stuck with him. Equal respect required. Like she was interviewing him as much as he was interviewing her. He didn't expect much. Maybe no response at all. Women looking for husbands out west usually wanted someone charming, someone social, someone who knew how to say the right things. Colton knew how to break horses and mend fences and survive blizzards. Everything else was outside his skill set. 2 weeks crawled by. The widow from Kansas wrote back, a pleasant letter full of questions about the ranch and the territory and what kind of life she might expect. Reasonable questions. Practical questions. The kind of questions that made Colton feel like he was being measured for a business transaction, which he supposed he was. But no letter came from Boston. He told himself it didn't matter. The widow would do. She seemed capable, and capability was all he needed. He started drafting a response, proposing she come out for a trial period, see if they suited each other before making anything legal. Then the stagecoach arrived on a Thursday afternoon, and everything changed. Colton had ridden into town for supplies, not expecting anything beyond the usual errands. But there was a commotion near the stage office, people gathering, talking in that excited way folks do when something unusual breaks up the monotony of frontier life. A woman stepped down from the coach. She wasn't what anyone expected. Tall, for one thing. Nearly as tall as some of the men watching. Dark hair pulled back severe and practical. Dressed in traveling clothes that looked expensive but worn, like she'd been on the road a long time. She moved with the kind of sharp efficiency that came from navigating hostile spaces, eyes scanning the crowd, shoulders squared, chin up despite the stares. "That's her?" someone whispered. "The one coming for Mercer?" "Must be. Nobody else getting off." "She looks mean. She looks old." Colton felt something hot and furious rise in his chest at that. The woman couldn't have been more than 30, maybe 32. But out here, that might as well be ancient for an unmarried woman. The whispers continued, getting crueler. "Spinster from back east. Probably couldn't find a man there, so she's trying out here. Mercer must be desperate. They both must be. The woman's eyes found him across the crowd, and Colton realized with a jolt that she knew exactly who he was. Something in her expression, calculating, measuring, utterly unafraid, told him this wasn't going to go the way he'd planned. She walked straight toward him, ignoring everyone else. "Colton Mercer?" Her voice carried that Eastern accent, crisp, educated, nothing like the softer drawls he was used to hearing. "That's me, Vivian Ashford." She didn't offer her hand, just stood there, one worn suitcase at her feet, looking at him like she was deciding whether he measured up. "You wrote to me about a partnership." "I wrote to you about marriage." "Same thing, if done correctly." She glanced around at the watching crowd, and something dismissive flickered across her face. "Is there somewhere we can talk? Somewhere less public?" The hotel restaurant was mostly empty at this hour. They took a table in the back corner, and Colton watched Vivian settle into her chair with the same precise efficiency she'd shown stepping off the stagecoach. Everything about her was controlled, deliberate. It made him nervous. "You didn't write back," he said finally. "I came instead." She accepted coffee from the waitress without bothering with pleasantries. "Letters take too long, and time seems to be something you're short on." "How did you—" "Your advertisement mentioned needing a wife within 30 days to keep your ranch. It wasn't difficult to deduce the situation." She took a sip of coffee, grimaced at the taste, but kept drinking anyway. "I assume you're facing some sort of legal pressure tied to marital status and land ownership." "Judge is trying to steal my property, says an unmarried man can't hold that much land. And you need a wife to prove you're establishing a proper homestead." She said it like she was quoting something distasteful. How very territorial of them. "You say that like you've seen this before." "Different details, same story." Vivian set her cup down with a sharp click. "Men with power using the law to take things from people with less power. It's not unique to the frontier, Mr. Mercer. We just dress it up prettier back east." Something in her voice made Colton look at her closer. There was history there, pain buried under all that sharp efficiency. "So why come out here?" he asked. "If you've already seen how this game goes." "Because I'm tired of playing by their rules." She met his eyes directly, and Colton saw something fierce there, something that didn't bend. "Back home, I made the mistake of trusting the wrong people. Lost everything I'd spent years building. Came out here because at least the frontier is honest about being brutal. Out here, if someone wants to take what's yours, they do it directly. Not hidden behind lawyers and polite society." "That's one way to look at it. It's the only way to look at it." She leaned forward slightly. "So here's what I'm proposing. You need a wife to keep your ranch. I need security and a fresh start somewhere nobody knows my past. We make this a real partnership, not you doing me some favor, not me being grateful for the opportunity. Equal investment, equal say, equal respect." "You want ownership of the ranch?" Colton felt his spine stiffen. "I want partnership in it. If I'm going to tie my entire future to yours, I need to know I'm building something too, not just helping you build something you can take away the moment I become inconvenient." "That's not how marriage works." "That's exactly how marriage works." Vivian's voice went hard. "Women marry men and lose every legal right to their own property, their own money, their own decisions. I've watched it destroy people. I won't let it destroy me." The waitress appeared with food neither of them had ordered, some kind of stew that smelled like it had been sitting too long. They both ignored it. "I worked 10 years for that ranch," Colton said quietly. "Every acre, every building, every fence post, it's mine. And I'm not trying to steal it. I'm trying to help you keep it." Vivian's expression softened slightly, though not much. "Look, I know what I'm asking isn't conventional, but nothing about this situation is conventional. You're facing legal theft. I'm starting over with nothing. We either help each other or we both lose." Colton studied her across the table. She was right. Nothing about this was conventional. And maybe that's what the situation needed. Someone who wouldn't just smile and nod and let him pretend this marriage was anything other than what it was, a legal maneuver to save what he'd built. But giving up control, even partial control of Iron Ridge, that stuck in his throat like ground glass. "I need to think about it." "You have 9 days left." Vivian stood, leaving the coffee and untouched food. "I'll be at the boarding house. Send word when you've decided." She walked out before he could respond, leaving him sitting there with cold stew and a decision that felt impossible either way. That night, back at the ranch, Colton couldn't sleep. He kept running through the conversation, trying to figure out what bothered him so much about Vivian Ashford. It wasn't that she was demanding or difficult. He'd dealt with difficult people his whole life. It wasn't even the partnership request, though that stung his pride like nothing else. It was that she saw through everything. She'd looked at him and immediately understood what this was about. Control. Fear of losing control. Fear of needing anyone. Fear of trusting anyone. And she'd called him on it without flinching. 3 days passed. Colton threw himself into work, fixing fence lines that didn't need fixing, reorganizing the barn that was already organized, anything to avoid making the decision. But the calendar didn't care about his avoidance. 6 days left, then 5, then 4. On the 4th day, he rode back into town. The boarding house was a tired 2-story building on the edge of the main street. The owner, a widow named Mrs. Chen, directed him upstairs with a knowing look that made Colton want to snap at her. He knocked on the door marked 3. Vivian answered immediately, like she'd been expecting him. She'd changed into simpler clothes, a plain dress that looked more suited to frontier life, but her expression was the same. Sharp. Waiting. "I'll agree to the partnership," Colton said before he could change his mind. "But it's not equal ownership. It's proportional to investment. I put in 10 years and everything I own. You're starting from nothing. That means I keep majority control." 60-40 split, 70-30. 65-35, and I get equal say in major ranch decisions. They stared at each other. Colton could feel the weight of this moment. Once he agreed, there was no going back. This wasn't like hiring a ranch hand he could fire if things didn't work out. This was binding, legal, permanent. "Deal," he said finally. Vivian stuck out her hand. Colton shook it, and her grip was firm enough to surprise him. "When?" she asked. "Tomorrow, before I change my mind." Something that might have been a smile flickered across her face. "Honest, I appreciate that." The wedding happened in Judge Harlan's chambers, which felt like adding insult to injury. Harlan presided with barely concealed satisfaction, probably already counting whatever money the development company had paid him. "Do you, Colton Mercer, take this woman?" "Yes." "And do you, Vivian Ashford?" "Yes." "Then by the power vested in me by the territory of Arizona, I pronounce you husband and wife." Harlan closed the book with a snap. "Congratulations. Sign here." They signed. 2 witnesses, clerk and deputy, who'd been pulled in from the hallway, signed below them. That was it. 10 minutes, and it was done. Walking out into the sunlight, Colton felt like he'd just stepped into a trap he'd set himself. "Well," Vivian said, looking around the street, "should we go see this ranch you've been so protective of?" The ride to Iron Ridge took 2 hours. Vivian sat beside him on the wagon seat, silent most of the way, just watching the landscape roll past. Colton tried to see it through her eyes, the harsh beauty of the desert, the distant mountains, the scrub brush and rock formations that had become so familiar he barely noticed them anymore. "It's bigger than I expected," she said finally, as they crested the ridge that gave the ranch its name. The valley spread below them, thousands of acres of grazing land. The main house and outbuildings clustered near the creek that provided year-round water. Cattle dotted the landscape, and Colton could see his 3 ranch hands working near the southern fence line. 10 years, he said quietly. This is what 10 years looks like. They reached the house as the sun started setting. The ranch hands, Danny, Miguel, and old Jack, had obviously heard about the marriage because they were waiting by the barn with expressions ranging from curious to skeptical. "Boys," Colton said, helping Vivian down from the wagon. "This is Vivian, my wife. She'll be living here now." Danny, the youngest at 19, tried to hide a smirk and failed. Miguel just nodded, professional as always. Jack, who'd been working ranches longer than Colton had been alive, studied Vivian with the calculating eye of someone who'd seen plenty of city folks come west and fail. "Ma'am," Jack said finally. "You ever worked a ranch before?" "No." Vivian met his gaze without flinching. "But I learn fast, and I'm not afraid of work. If you're willing to teach, I'm willing to learn." Something in Jack's expression shifted. "Fair enough." Colton showed her the house. The kitchen, the front room, the bedroom upstairs. It was simple, functional, built by someone who valued practicality over comfort. I'll sleep in the spare room, Colton said when they reached the top of the stairs. This arrangement is legal, not. We're not going to pretend it's something it's not. Agreed. Vivian set her suitcase down. Thank you for being direct about it. They stood there awkwardly for a moment, two strangers who'd just legally bound themselves together, not sure what came next. I'll let you settle in, Colton said finally. Dinner's usually around 6, nothing fancy. I can cook. You don't have to. I know I don't have to, but if I'm living here, I'm contributing. That's how partnerships work. She said it matter-of-factly, like it was the most obvious thing in the world. Colton nodded and retreated downstairs, feeling like he'd somehow lost an argument he didn't know he was having. That first dinner was tense. The ranch hands ate quickly and excused themselves, clearly uncomfortable with the new dynamic. Colton and Vivian sat at opposite ends of the table, the silence stretching between them like barbed wire. The books are in the office, Vivian asked finally. What books? Ranch accounts. Financial records? You said I'd have equal say in major decisions. I can't do that without understanding the operation. Colton's jaw tightened. Those books are private. I'm your wife and business partner. Nothing about ranch business should be private from me. I run this ranch. I've been running it fine for 10 years without someone looking over my shoulder. And now you're running it with a partner. Vivian's voice stayed level, but something hard flashed in her eyes. We agreed on this. Don't make me regret coming here after one day. They stared at each other across the table, and Colton felt that familiar anger rising, the anger that came from someone pushing into his space, into his control, into the carefully structured world he'd built specifically to avoid depending on anyone. Fine, he bit out. Office is off the kitchen. Help yourself. He stood and walked out, letting the door slam behind him. Standing in the yard, breathing the cool night air, Colton tried to calm the fury burning in his chest. This was his ranch, his rules, his life. And now there was someone else in it, demanding access to things he'd never shared with anyone. But you agreed to this, a voice in his head reminded him. You made this deal because the alternative was losing everything. Inside, through the window, he could see Vivian moving around the kitchen, cleaning up the dinner dishes. Efficient, practical. Exactly what he'd thought he wanted. So why did it feel like he'd just invited a storm into his house? The first week was Cold War by another name. They were polite, careful. Both of them dancing around each other, maintaining the agreement while silently fighting for territory. Vivian spent hours in the office, going through the ranch books with the kind of methodical attention that made Colton nervous. She didn't comment on what she found, didn't ask questions, just took notes and stayed quiet. It made him more nervous than if she'd confronted him directly. On the 8th day, she finally emerged from the office with a ledger in hand. We need to talk, she said. Colton looked up from the harness he was repairing. About what? About the fact that your accounts are a disaster. The anger came back, sharp and immediate. There's nothing wrong with my accounts. You're losing money on feed costs because you're buying from the most expensive supplier in the territory. Your cattle sales are inconsistent because you're not tracking market prices. And someone's been stealing from you. That stopped him cold. What? Vivian opened the ledger, pointing to a series of entries. These purchase orders don't match the inventory. Someone's been skimming supplies and covering their tracks by altering the numbers. Not much, just enough that you wouldn't notice without looking close. But it's been going on for at least a year. Colton stared at the numbers, his mind racing. Who? I don't know yet, but I will. She closed the ledger. This is fixable, Colton. All of it. The suppliers, the market timing, the theft. But you have to trust me to help fix it. He wanted to argue, wanted to tell her she was wrong, that his ranch was fine, that he didn't need some Eastern woman who'd been here a week telling him how to run his operation. But the numbers didn't lie. What do you need from me? He asked finally. Access. Information. And for you to stop treating me like an enemy. Vivian's voice softened slightly. I know this is hard. I know you didn't want a partner. But I'm here now, and I'm good at this. Let me help. Over the next 3 weeks, Vivian tore through Iron Ridge Ranch like a controlled wildfire, burning away inefficiency and dead weight, leaving stronger foundations in her wake. She renegotiated supply contracts, saving them 30% on feed costs. She established relationships with cattle buyers in 3 territories, ensuring better prices and consistent sales. She reorganized the books using a system she'd learned working in her father's business back east, making everything transparent and trackable. And she caught the thief. It was Danny, the youngest ranch hand. He'd been taking small amounts of supplies and selling them in town, altering the purchase records to cover his tracks. Not enough to hurt the ranch badly, but enough to supplement his wages. Vivian brought the evidence to Colton one evening, laying it out in the office with the same clinical efficiency she brought to everything. "He's been stealing for 14 months, she said. "Small stuff mostly. Tools, leather goods, extra feed. Adds up to about $300 total." Colton felt something break inside him. Danny had been with him for 3 years, had worked hard, seemed trustworthy, and all that time he'd been stealing. "I'll handle it," he said quietly. "How?" "Run him off the ranch, tonight." "That's one option." Vivian closed the ledger. "Or you could ask him why." "Why?" Colton's voice rose despite himself. "Because he's a thief, that's why. He's 19 years old, making $30 a month, and sending most of it home to his mother in Texas. I found the correspondence in the bunkhouse." Vivian held up a worn letter. "His father died last year. Medical debts. Danny's been trying to keep his family from losing their farm." The anger in Colton's chest twisted into something more complicated. "That doesn't excuse stealing." "No, it doesn't, but it explains it." Vivian stood. "I'm not saying let him off. I'm saying understand what you're dealing with before you make a decision. Maybe there's a way to handle this that doesn't end with a kid losing his job and his family losing their farm." Colton met with Danny the next morning. The kid looked terrified, already knowing he'd been caught. "I'm sorry," Danny said before Colton could speak. "I know there's no excuse. Ma needed help, and I couldn't. I'm sorry." Colton looked at this kid who'd betrayed him, and all he could see was himself at that age, desperate, alone, willing to do whatever it took to survive. "You're going to pay it back," he said finally. "Every dollar. I'll dock your wages 20% until it's settled. You try anything like this again, you're gone. Understood?" Danny's eyes went wide. You're not firing me?" "I'm giving you a chance to make this right. Don't make me regret it." After Danny left, Vivian appeared from wherever she'd been waiting. "Thank you," she said quietly. "I didn't do it for you." "I know. You did it because it was right." She paused. "But thank you anyway." Something shifted between them after that. The Cold War thawed slightly. They started talking more. Real conversations about the ranch, about plans, about problems that needed solving. Colton still caught himself pulling back, maintaining distance, protecting his boundaries. But Vivian kept pushing forward with that quiet, relentless determination that he was beginning to recognize as her defining trait. The ranch started thriving in ways it never had before. Profits increased. Operations smoothed out. Even the other ranchers in the territory started noticing. But with success came attention, and not all of it friendly. The trouble started on a Tuesday afternoon when 4 men rode onto Iron Ridge property uninvited. Colton and Miguel were working on the northern fence line when they appeared. Rough-looking men with hard eyes and guns worn low on their hips, not the kind of visitors who came for social calls. "Help you, gentlemen?" Colton kept his voice level, his hand close to his rifle. The leader, a scarred man with a smile that didn't reach his eyes, leaned forward in his saddle. "Heard you got a new wife. Heard she's been making changes around here." "News travels fast." "It does when those changes affect other people's business." The man's smile faded. "See, we had an arrangement with Danny. He'd sell us supplies, we'd give him fair prices. Now that arrangement's ended. That's inconvenient for us." Understanding hit Colton like cold water. "You were buying the stolen goods. We were providing a service to a kid in need. Now we're looking for a new supplier." The man's eyes flicked toward the house, where Vivian was visible through the window. "Maybe you could talk to your wife, explain how things work out here, how cooperation benefits everyone." "Get off my land." "That's unfriendly." "It's going to get a lot more unfriendly if you're not gone in the next 30 seconds. Colton raised his rifle slightly, and Miguel did the same. The men exchanged looks. For a moment, Colton thought they might try something stupid. Then the leader shrugged. "We'll be seeing you, Mercer." He turned his horse. "One way or another." They rode off, but Colton knew this wasn't over. That night, he told Vivian what happened. She listened without interrupting, her face unreadable. "They'll come back," she said finally. "I know. So what do we do?" Colton met her eyes, and something passed between them, an understanding that they were in this together now, whether they liked it or not. "We get ready." The next morning started with tension thick enough to choke on. Colton had the ranch hands gather before sunrise. Danny, Miguel, and Jack standing in the pre-dawn cold while he laid out the situation. "We've got trouble coming," he said bluntly. "4 men who don't like how things have changed around here. They were profiting off the theft, and now they're looking to make a point." Jack spat into the dirt. "Rustlers? Worse. Men with a grudge and nothing to lose." Colton looked at each of them in turn. "Anyone wants to leave, now's the time. No hard feelings. This isn't your fight." Danny stepped forward immediately. "It's my fault they're mad. I'm staying." Miguel nodded. "We all stay." Jack just laughed, a dry sound like wind through dead leaves. "Hell, Mercer, I've been shot at by better men than whoever you're worried about. Takes more than threats to run me off." Something in Colton's chest loosened slightly. He'd spent 10 years building walls around himself, convinced that needing people made you weak. But standing there with these men who chose to stay despite the danger, he started wondering if maybe isolation wasn't the strength he'd always thought it was. "All right then, we work in pairs. Nobody goes anywhere alone. Rifles stay close. Vivian," he turned to find her already standing in the doorway, fully dressed despite the early hour. "You stay near the house." "No." She walked down the porch steps. Her face set in that expression he was learning meant she'd already made up her mind. "If we're defending this ranch, I need to know how to defend myself. Teach me to shoot." "That's not—" "Not what? Not proper?" Her eyes flashed. "Those men threatened us, Colton, both of us. I'm not hiding in the house waiting to see what happens." Jack made a sound that might have been approval. Miguel tried to hide a smile. Even Danny looked impressed. Colton knew he'd lost this argument before it started. "Fine. After breakfast. But you do exactly what I tell you." "Of course." Vivian's tone suggested she'd agree to exactly nothing beyond what made sense to her, but Colton let it go. They spent the morning in the clearing behind the barn, tin cans lined up on fence posts like tiny soldiers. Vivian held the rifle awkwardly at first, her body too stiff, her aim uncertain. "Relax your shoulders," Colton said, moving to stand behind her. "The gun's a tool, not an enemy. You're trying to control it instead of working with it." "I'm trying not to shoot myself in the foot. That's a low bar. Try aiming for the cans instead." She shot him a look over her shoulder, and he realized with surprise that she was nervous. Vivian, who'd faced down corrupt businessmen and traveled halfway across the country alone, was actually nervous about firing a rifle. "It's loud," she said quietly, like admitting weakness. "The sound. It reminds me of—" She didn't finish, but Colton heard what she wasn't saying. Reminded her of something bad, something she'd left behind in Boston. "Close your eyes," he said. "That seems counterproductive. Just do it." She did, and he guided her hands to the correct position, adjusting her stance until her body aligned naturally with the weapon. "Now breathe. Don't think about the noise. Think about where you want the bullet to go. Your body knows what to do. You just have to stop fighting it." That's remarkably philosophical for a shooting lesson. "Open your eyes and fire before I change my mind about teaching you." Vivian squeezed the trigger. The rifle cracked, and the leftmost can went spinning off the post. She lowered the gun slowly, staring at the fence line like she couldn't quite believe what just happened. "Again," Colton said. By noon, she'd hit 5 out of 8 cans. Not perfect, but competent enough that she wouldn't be helpless if trouble came. They walked back to the house together, the morning sun turning the desert into something almost beautiful. "Thank you," Vivian said, "for not arguing about this." "I did argue. And then you taught me anyway. That's what matters." She paused at the porch steps. "Can I ask you something?" "Depends on the question." "Those men yesterday, you weren't surprised they existed, weren't shocked that people would steal and threaten violence over a few dollars of supplies." She turned to face him fully. "What happened to you out here, Colton? What made you so certain everyone's an enemy?" The question hit harder than he expected. For a moment he considered deflecting, making some comment about frontier life being harsh, about how you learned not to trust people or you didn't survive. Easy answers that didn't mean anything. But Vivian was watching him with those sharp eyes that saw through all his walls, and something in him cracked. "I was 17 when I came to Arizona," he said quietly. "Alone. Parents died of fever when I was 15, and the relatives who took me in made it clear I was a burden, so I left, figured I'd make my own way. That's young to be alone. It's how things were. I worked ranches for other men, saved every dollar, learned everything I could. Met a man named Carson who said he'd partner with me, put up half the money for land if I'd put up the other half and do the work. We shook on it. Spent 3 years building this place together." Vivian's expression shifted, understanding where this was going. "Then one day I came back from driving cattle to market and found him gone. Cleaned out our accounts, forged my signature on papers selling his half to someone else, disappeared. Left me with debt and half a ranch and no legal recourse because I'd been stupid enough to trust a handshake." "That's not stupid. That's trusting someone you had every reason to trust. Same result either way." Colton looked out at the land he'd fought to keep. "Took me 7 years to dig out of that hole. 7 years of working harder than any man should have to work, of never asking for help, never depending on anyone. And now here you are, demanding partnership, demanding trust, demanding I open up everything I've protected. And you're terrified I'll do the same thing he did." It wasn't a question. Colton didn't answer because he didn't need to. "I'm not Carson," Vivian said firmly, "and I can't prove that to you with words. I can only prove it by staying, by doing the work, by being the partner you needed then and never got. And if you change your mind, then I'll tell you directly instead of disappearing in the night like a coward." She met his eyes. "I made a deal with you, Colton. I keep my deals, always." Something in the way she said it, with absolute conviction, like the idea of breaking her word was physically impossible, made him believe her. Not completely. Not yet. But enough to take the next breath without feeling like the ground was about to open up beneath him. They didn't talk about it again, but the conversation changed things between them. The careful distance they'd maintained started closing, replaced by something that felt almost like friendship. Almost. 3 days later, the trouble came back. It was past midnight when Colton jerked awake to the smell of smoke. For a moment he thought he was dreaming, caught in some nightmare about the barn fire that had destroyed his first attempt at building this place. Then he heard shouting outside and knew this was real. He grabbed his rifle and hit the stairs at a run. Vivian was already up, standing at the window in her nightdress with her own rifle. When had she started keeping it in her room, watching orange flames lick up the side of the equipment shed? "How bad?" Colton asked, already pulling on boots. "Not the main barn yet, but it will be if we don't stop it." They ran out together into chaos. Danny and Miguel were already throwing water on the flames while Jack worked to move horses out of the barn, talking to them in that low, calm voice he used to gentle, spooked animals. The fire had engulfed most of the equipment shed, the building Colton used to store tools, spare lumber, anything metal that wouldn't burn easily. Except someone had made sure it would burn. He could see the dark stains of accelerant splashed across the walls, the way the flames spread too fast and too hungry to be natural. "Buckets!" he shouted. "Form a line from the well." They worked in desperate coordination, passing buckets hand to hand, throwing water that felt pathetically inadequate against the rage of the fire. Smoke burned Colton's eyes and throat. Heat pressed against his skin like a living thing. But they kept going because stopping meant losing everything. Vivian worked beside him without complaint, her nightdress soaked and filthy, her hands already blistering from the rope handles of the buckets. Once he saw her stumble, and he reached out automatically to steady her. She nodded thanks and kept moving. It took 2 hours to kill the fire. By the time the last ember was doused, the equipment shed was nothing but charred timber and twisted metal. But the barn had survived. The house had survived. Nobody had died. Colton stood in the wreckage as dawn started breaking, looking at the destruction and feeling something hot and violent building in his chest. This wasn't random. This wasn't accident. Someone had come onto his land while he slept and tried to burn him out. "Boss?" Miguel appeared at his elbow, holding something out. "Found this on the fence line." It was a note, pinned to a post with a knife. The message was short. "Next time we won't miss." Colton crumpled the paper in his fist, rage washing through him so strong he could taste it. He'd tried to do this right. Tried to follow the law, play by the rules, build something legitimate that nobody could take from him, and still they came. Still they tried to destroy what was his. "We ride out today," he said, his voice coming out flat and dangerous. "Find these men. End this." "No." Vivian's voice cut through the red haze of his anger. He turned on her. "They just tried to burn us out." "I know. I was there." She walked toward him, her face streaked with soot, her eyes fierce despite exhaustion. "And riding out angry is exactly what they want. You go looking for them like this, you'll make a mistake. Someone will die. Maybe one of them. Maybe one of us. So we do nothing. We do something smart." She gestured at the destroyed shed. "They came here to prove they could hurt us, to make us scared. Instead, we're going to prove we're not going anywhere." "How?" "We rebuild. Today. Right now." Vivian turned to address the ranch hands. "Everyone who can swing a hammer, we're putting up a new shed. Better than the old one. By tonight, there won't be any evidence they touched us." Danny looked at Miguel, who looked at Jack. None of them spoke, but Colton could see the question in their eyes. Are we really listening to her? He took a breath, forcing down the fury that wanted him to ride out and find blood. Vivian was right. He hated that she was right, but she was. Going after those men now would accomplish nothing except maybe getting someone killed. "You heard her," he said finally. "Let's get to work." They worked through the day like men possessed. Jack rode to town to buy lumber while the rest of them cleared the wreckage and prepared the foundation. Vivian disappeared into the house and came back with food, sandwiches and coffee, and later a proper meal that appeared despite the fact that nobody had seen her stop working long enough to cook it. By sunset, they had the frame up. By midnight, they had walls and a roof. It wasn't pretty, but it was solid, and when Colton finally stepped back to look at what they'd built in a single day, he felt something shift in his chest. "We're going to have to tell the sheriff about this," Vivian said, appearing beside him with 2 cups of coffee. She handed him one without asking if he wanted it. "Sheriff won't do anything." "Probably not. But we file a report anyway. Create a record. That way, when those men try something else, we've got documentation showing a pattern." Colton looked at her, this woman who'd been in his life less than 2 months and was already changing everything about how he thought and operated. "You've done this before. Built a case piece by piece. Had to back in Boston. When the law won't protect you, you protect yourself by making sure everyone knows exactly what happened." She took a sip of coffee, staring at the new shed. "It doesn't always work, but it's better than nothing." "What happened in Boston?" The question came out before he could stop it. "You said you lost everything. What did you lose?" Vivian was quiet for so long he thought she wouldn't answer. Then, slowly, she started talking. "My father owned a textile business. Not huge, but successful. Employed 40 people. When he died, he left it to me. Not because I was his daughter, but because I'd been running it with him for years. I knew every contract, every supplier, every customer." Her voice went flat, empty of emotion in a way that made Colton's chest tight. "His business partner contested the will, said a woman couldn't run a business, that my father must have been sick when he wrote those documents. Took me to court. You fought it. For 2 years, spent everything I had on lawyers, lost anyway. Judge ruled the business should go to the partner, a man who'd contributed nothing in 10 years but still had more legal right to it than I did." She laughed, but there was no humor in it. 6 months later, the business collapsed. The partner ran it into the ground through incompetence and embezzlement. 40 people lost their jobs. Everything my father built, gone. And they blamed you. Of course they blamed me. I was the one who fought, who made noise, who didn't just accept the ruling quietly. Vivian's hands tightened around her coffee cup. "Lost my home to pay legal debts, lost my reputation, lost any chance of working in that industry again. So I came west because at least out here, if someone's going to destroy you, they're honest about it." Colton thought about Carson, about betrayal, about how many different ways people found to take what wasn't theirs. "I'm sorry." "Don't be. It taught me something important." She finally looked at him. "Fighting alone means you lose. Fighting with people you trust means you might actually win. Is that why you insisted on partnership? Because you lost everything fighting alone? That's why I insisted we build something real instead of a legal fiction." She finished her coffee and handed him the empty cup. "I'm going to sleep for about 12 hours. Try not to burn anything else down while I'm unconscious." She walked toward the house, and Colton watched her go, trying to reconcile the sharp, controlled woman he'd married with the person who'd just told him about losing everything. She'd been through hell back east, maybe worse than what he'd survived, and she'd still gotten on a stagecoach and traveled 1,000 miles to start over. That took a kind of courage he wasn't sure he possessed. The next week passed without incident, which made Colton more nervous than the fire had. Men who burned sheds didn't just give up. They waited. They planned. They came back. But life on the ranch continued. Cattle needed tending. Fences needed mending. The seasonal work of keeping 1,000 acres running didn't stop for threats or fear. Vivian threw herself into learning the operation with the same intensity she brought to everything. She rode out with Miguel to check fence lines, learned the difference between healthy cattle and sick ones, memorized the geography of every water source on the property. Within a month, she could discuss ranch business with a competence that surprised everyone except Colton, who'd stopped being surprised by what she could do. What did surprise him was how much he'd started relying on her opinion. "The Henderson Ranch is selling," she mentioned one evening over dinner. 400 acres adjacent to our eastern border." "Henderson?" Colton looked up from his plate. "Thought he was determined to keep that land in the family." "He was. Then his son died in a mining accident, and suddenly he doesn't have anyone to pass it to." Vivian pushed papers across the table. "He's asking $12,000. It's more than it's worth, but the water rights alone make it valuable." "We don't have $12,000. We have 8, and I've been talking to the bank about credit terms." Colton's fork stopped halfway to his mouth. "You've been talking to the bank? That's what partners do. They explore opportunities." She met his eyes calmly. "Unless you don't want to expand." "It's not about wanting. It's about—" He stopped, trying to figure out what bothered him about this. The expansion made sense. The price was high but manageable. Adding 400 acres would solidify their water access and give them room to increase the herd. "It's about you doing this without telling me," he said finally. "I'm telling you now, after you've already talked to the bank." Vivian set down her fork with deliberate care. "What would you have done if I'd mentioned this idea before talking to anyone? Would you have listened, or would you have said no immediately because it came from me?" The accusation stung because it was probably accurate. Even now, after everything, his first instinct was to reject anything that felt like someone else making decisions about his ranch. "I would have listened," he said, knowing it sounded defensive. "All right, then listen now. Henderson needs to sell quickly. He's moving to California to be near his daughter. If we wait, someone else will buy that land, and we'll lose the opportunity. The bank is willing to extend credit based on our improved operation and financial records. We can afford this, Colton. We just have to decide if we trust each other enough to take the risk." There it was again. Trust. Everything between them kept circling back to trust. Whether he could give it, whether she'd earned it, whether either of them knew how to build something on it. "Let me see the numbers," he said finally. They spent the next hour going over financials, discussing payment plans, arguing about details until they'd hammered out terms they both agreed on. By the time they finished, it was past midnight, and Colton's head hurt from numbers and negotiations. "We should sleep on it," Vivian said, stacking the papers neatly. "Make a final decision tomorrow." "We buy it." The words came out before Colton fully thought them through. "You're sure?" He wasn't sure of much anymore, but watching Vivian work, seeing her dedication to this place, to building something that would last, that he was sure about. "Yeah, I'm sure." Something in her expression shifted, not quite a smile, but close. "All right then, partners?" Partners. They shook on it, and Colton felt the weight of what they were building together. Not just the ranch, but something bigger. Something that scared him more than any fire or threat, because it required trusting someone with more than just his land. It required trusting them with his future. The Henderson deal closed 2 weeks later. Colton signed his name on documents that put the ranch deeper in debt than it had ever been, and tried not to think about how spectacularly this could fail. But Vivian had been right about the water rights. The new land gave them access to a spring that flowed year-round, eliminating their dependence on the creek that sometimes ran low in summer. Jack and Danny rode out to inspect the fences on the new property, while Miguel started planning where to move cattle. The operation expanded, and with it, the workload increased exponentially. Colton found himself working 18-hour days, falling into bed exhausted, only to wake before dawn and start again. Vivian matched him hour for hour, never complaining, never slowing down. They developed a rhythm, not comfortable exactly, but functional, efficient. Then one afternoon, riding back from checking the northern herd, they ran into trouble. 4 riders blocked the path, the same men from before. The scarred leader sat his horse with lazy confidence, like he owned the trail and everything around it. "Heard you bought the Henderson place," he said conversationally. "Moving up in the world." Colton's hand moved toward his rifle, but Vivian's voice stopped him. "We're expanding our operation, yes. Is there something we can help you with?" The man's eyes shifted to her, and something ugly moved across his face. "You're the Boston woman, the one causing all the changes." "I'm Vivian Mercer. And you are?" "Someone you should have paid more attention to." He leaned forward in his saddle. "See, that Henderson land? We had plans for it. Plans that didn't include it going to some upstart ranch run by a man who can't control his own wife." Colton felt rage spike hot and immediate. "Get off our land, now!" "Or what? You'll shoot us?" The man laughed. "There's 4 of us and 2 of you, and even if you got lucky, you'd be murderers. We're just having a conversation." "This conversation is over." Vivian's voice went cold as winter steel. "You have 10 seconds to turn around and ride away. If you're still here after that, we'll assume you're trespassing with intent to harm, and we'll act accordingly." "You threatening us, woman?" "I'm clarifying this situation. 10 seconds started 5 seconds ago." The men exchanged looks, clearly uncertain how to handle a woman who wouldn't back down. The scarred leader's face darkened with anger, but he must have seen something in Vivian's expression, or maybe in Colton's, that convinced him this wasn't the time to push further. "This isn't over," he said, pulling his horse around. "Not even close." They rode off, and Colton waited until they were out of sight before letting out the breath he'd been holding. "That was reckless," he said. "That was necessary." Vivian's hands were shaking slightly where they gripped her reins, but her voice stayed steady. "If we show fear, they win. If we back down, they keep pushing until there's nothing left to push. They could have shot us. They could have." She turned her horse toward home. "Because they're bullies, and bullies depend on fear. Take away the fear, and they don't know what to do." Colton followed her, his mind racing through possibilities and consequences. Those men wouldn't give up. The confrontation today just raised the stakes. Sooner or later, this was going to end in violence. He needed to be ready. That night, after everyone else had gone to sleep, Colton sat in the office going over maps of the property. The new Henderson land extended their eastern border by half a mile, but it also created new vulnerabilities, more fence line to patrol, more area where trouble could slip through unnoticed. "Can't sleep either?" Vivian's voice came from the doorway. He looked up to find her standing there in her nightclothes, hair loose around her shoulders. For the first time since she'd arrived, she looked tired. Actually tired. Not just physically exhausted, but worn down to the bone. "Planning patrol routes," he said. "At 1 a.m? When else am I going to do it?" She walked into the office and looked at the map spread across the desk. "You're expecting them to come back, aren't you?" "Yes, but I'm also expecting we'll be ready." She traced a line on the map. "The Henderson Spring is our weakness. It's isolated, surrounded by rocks where someone could hide. If I wanted to hurt us, that's where I'd start." Colton studied the area she'd indicated. She was right. The spring was valuable precisely because it was remote, but that remoteness made it vulnerable. "We post someone there," he said, thinking out loud. "Rotating shifts. Make sure it's never unwatched." "That spreads us thin." "Everything spreads us thin. We're 4 men, and you trying to defend 1,200 acres. 5 men and me," Vivian corrected. "I can handle a rifle well enough now to take a shift." "No. Don't start that again." Her eyes flashed. "We're past the point where you can protect me by keeping me close to the house. I'm in this fight, whether you like it or not." They stared at each other across the desk, and Colton felt the familiar frustration of arguing with someone who refused to be reasonable. Except she was being reasonable. She was right. They needed every person they had, and Vivian had proven she could handle herself. But the thought of her alone at that spring, vulnerable to men who'd already tried to burn them out, that made something twist painfully in his chest. "Fine," he said finally. "But you take shifts with Miguel, never alone." "Agreed." They spent another hour working out patrol schedules and fallback plans, their voices low in the quiet house. At some point, Vivian made coffee, and they drank it while discussing defense strategies like they were planning a military operation instead of trying to protect a ranch. How did we get here? Colton asked suddenly. What do you mean? 2 months ago, I didn't even know you existed. Now we're sitting here at 2 in the morning planning how to defend against men who want to destroy us. He shook his head. Feels surreal. Welcome to partnership. Vivian's mouth quirked in something that wasn't quite a smile. It's not what either of us expected, but it's what we've got. You ever regret it, coming here? She considered the question seriously, not jumping to reassure him. Some days, when I'm exhausted and scared and wondering if we're going to survive what's coming. But then I look at what we're building and I remember why I came. This place matters, Colton, not just to you, to both of us now. Even if it gets us killed? Especially then. She met his eyes. I'd rather die fighting for something real than live safely pretending nothing matters. Wouldn't you? He thought about Carson, about betrayal, about the 10 years he'd spent building walls around himself to avoid ever being vulnerable again. And then he thought about Vivian, this fierce, complicated woman who'd walked into his carefully controlled life and blown it apart. Yeah, he said quietly. I would. They sat there in the lamplight, two people who'd been strangers 3 months ago, bound together now by legal documents and shared danger, and something neither of them wanted to name. Outside, the Arizona night pressed close around the ranch, and somewhere in that darkness, men were planning their next move. But inside, for just this moment, Colton felt something he hadn't felt in years. He felt like maybe, possibly, he wasn't alone anymore. The attack came 3 days later, but not in any way they'd anticipated. Colton was riding the southern fence line with Jack when they found the first dead steer. Then another. Then 5 more scattered across a quarter mile, all shot through the head and left to rot in the sun. Those bastards. Jack dismounted, examining the closest carcass. This wasn't even about the meat. This was just killing to kill. Colton felt his vision narrow to a pinpoint, rage so complete it drowned out everything else. 6 steers represented months of investment, hundreds of dollars in lost revenue. But more than that, it was the cruelty of it, killing animals for no purpose except to hurt him. Get Miguel and Danny, he said, his voice coming out flat and dead. We're riding out to find whoever did this. Boss, now Jack. By the time they gathered at the house, Colton had worked himself into something cold and murderous. He checked his rifle, loaded extra ammunition, prepared himself for violence he'd been avoiding for years but couldn't avoid anymore. Vivian met him at the door. Don't, she said simply. They killed our cattle. Just killed them and left them. They're declaring war, and I'm going to finish it. By riding out angry and getting yourself killed? She stepped in front of him, physically blocking his path. That's what they want, Colton. They want you reckless. They want you to make a mistake. Get out of my way. No. They stood there in a standoff, Colton's fury crashing against Vivian's immovable calm. Behind him, he could feel the ranch hands watching, waiting to see who would win this confrontation. Those men need to pay, Colton said through gritted teeth. They will pay. But through the law, not through you becoming a murderer. Vivian's voice softened slightly. Please. Think about what you're risking. Not just your life, everything we've built. If you kill someone, even in revenge, the judge will take this ranch so fast it'll make your head spin. Is that what you want? I want them to stop. Then we make them stop the right way. She reached up and took the rifle from his hands before he could react. We document everything. We report it. We build a case. And if they come onto our land again, we defend ourselves legally. But riding out for revenge? That's suicide. Colton wanted to argue, wanted to push past her and do what every instinct in his body was screaming for him to do. But somewhere through the red haze, he heard the truth in her words. If he killed those men, even if they deserved it, he'd lose everything anyway. Fine, he said, the word tasting like ash. We do it your way. Relief flickered across Vivian's face, so quick he almost missed it. I'll ride to town and file a report with the sheriff. You stay here and document the losses. Photographs if possible. Exact locations. Everything. Vivian, I know the sheriff won't do anything, but we need the record. She was already moving, gathering her riding gear with that efficiency that never stopped. Danny, you're coming with me. Miguel, Jack, you help Colton with the documentation. She was out the door before anyone could protest, and Colton realized with a mixture of frustration and something that might have been admiration that she'd just taken command of the entire situation. The ride to town took 2 hours. Vivian kept Danny at a steady pace, not rushing despite the urgency, because showing up flustered would undermine everything she was trying to accomplish. Sheriff Morrison was exactly what she expected. A tired man in his 50s who'd stopped caring about justice somewhere around the time he realized the job was mostly paperwork and politics. Mrs. Mercer. He didn't stand when she entered. What can I do for you? Someone killed 6 of our cattle last night, shot them and left them to rot. She placed her written statement on his desk. I'm here to file a formal report. Morrison barely glanced at the paper. Cattle die all the time out here. Could have been coyotes. Coyotes don't use rifles. You got proof it was deliberate? 6 headshot execution style in a straight line? Yes, Sheriff, I'd say that's fairly deliberate. Vivian kept her voice level despite the anger building in her chest. We both know who's responsible. The same men who've been threatening us for weeks. Got any names? Witnesses? Evidence beyond dead cattle? We have a pattern of harassment that I've been documenting. Threats, arson, now killing livestock. She pulled out a folder containing copies of everything. The threatening note, statements from the ranch hands, financial records showing the losses. This is escalating, Sheriff. If you don't intervene, someone's going to get killed. Morrison finally looked at her, and Vivian saw the calculation in his eyes. He knew exactly what was happening and didn't care enough to stop it. I'll look into it, he said, which they both knew meant he'd do nothing. You understand that if something happens, if those men attack our ranch again and we're forced to defend ourselves, this report establishes that we tried to resolve this through legal channels first. That got his attention. You threatening to take the law into your own hands. I'm establishing that we followed proper procedure and received no protection from the authorities sworn to provide it. What happens after that is on you, not us. She stood, gathering her documents. Good day, Sheriff. Outside, Danny was waiting with the horses, trying and failing to hide a grin. You just threatened the sheriff, he said as they mounted up. I established our legal position. There's a difference. That's not how he's going to see it. I don't particularly care how he sees it. Vivian turned her horse toward home. Come on, we've got work to do. They were halfway back to the ranch when Danny cleared his throat nervously. Ma'am, can I ask you something? You just did, but go ahead. Why are you doing this? He gestured vaguely. All of this. You could have stayed in Boston, lived a comfortable life, but you came out here and you're fighting like it's your ranch, not Colton's. Vivian was quiet for a moment, considering how much to tell this 19-year-old kid who was trying to understand a world that kept refusing to make sense. Because comfortable isn't the same as free, she said finally. Back east, I had to ask permission for everything, permission to run a business, permission to speak my mind, permission to exist as something other than decoration or burden. Out here, at least I can fight, can build something that's actually mine, that's worth more than comfort. Even if it gets you killed, especially then. She looked at him. You understand that, don't you? You came back after being caught stealing because you wanted to fix what you broke, because your integrity mattered more than the easy path. Danny's face flushed. That's different. Not as different as you think. They rode in silence for a while, and Vivian let herself feel the exhaustion she'd been fighting all day. The constant vigilance, the pressure of always being 3 steps ahead, the weight of knowing that one mistake could cost them everything. It was grinding her down in ways she hadn't expected. But she'd meant what she said. This life, hard as it was, belonged to her in a way nothing back east ever had. When they reached the ranch, Colton was waiting on the porch, his expression dark. Sheriff won't do anything, Vivian said, dismounting. I know. I could have told you that and saved you the ride. Yes, but now we have documentation that we tried. She handed him copies of everything she'd filed. When this ends badly, and it will end badly, we'll be legally protected. You sound awfully certain it's going to end badly, don't you? Colton didn't answer, which was answer enough. That night, they doubled the watch. Miguel took first shift at the Henderson Spring while Jack patrolled the main property. Danny stayed near the house, and Colton and Vivian spelled each other every 4 hours. Vivian took the midnight to 4 shift, standing in the cold darkness with her rifle and her thoughts. The desert at night was beautiful in a hostile way. Stars so bright they hurt to look at. Silence so complete you could hear your own heartbeat. She'd grown to love this landscape despite its cruelty, or maybe because of it. Movement caught her eye near the barn. She raised the rifle, finger on the trigger, heart suddenly hammering. Then the figure moved into moonlight and she saw it was Colton, unable to sleep, checking the property for the third time that night. "You're supposed to be resting," she called softly. He jumped, hand going to his gun before he recognized her voice. "Could say the same to you." "I'm on watch." "You're just anxious." "Same thing." He walked over to where she stood. "Can't stop thinking about those cattle, about how much further they're willing to push this. As far as it takes to break us or kill us. Men like that don't have limits." Vivian lowered the rifle. "But neither do we. That's what they keep underestimating." Colton studied her profile in the moonlight. "You ever get scared?" "Constantly. I'm just good at not showing it." "That's not comforting." "It's honest." She turned to face him fully. "I'm scared we're going to lose this place. Scared someone's going to get hurt. Scared that all the fighting won't matter in the end. But fear doesn't change what needs doing, so I do it anyway." "That's either really brave or really stupid." "Probably both." She smiled slightly. "Most worthwhile things are." They stood together in comfortable silence, and Vivian felt something shift between them, some barrier that had been there since the beginning finally starting to crack. Not gone, but weakening. "Thank you," Colton said suddenly, "for stopping me today. I would have done something we couldn't take back." "You don't need to thank me. Partners stop each other from making catastrophic mistakes. It's in the job description. Still, thank you." The sincerity in his voice made her chest tight. She'd spent so long armoring herself against disappointment that genuine gratitude felt almost foreign. "You're welcome," she said quietly. Colton headed back inside and Vivian resumed her watch. But something had changed. The night felt less lonely. The danger felt less overwhelming. Maybe that's what partnership actually meant. Not facing threats alone, but having someone who'd stand in the darkness with you and refuse to let you fall. The next 2 weeks were tense but quiet. No more dead cattle. No more fires. Just the normal hard work of running a ranch and the constant vigilance of waiting for the next attack. Vivian threw herself into the financial side of the operation, finding inefficiencies and fixing them with ruthless precision. She renegotiated their supply contracts again, saving another 15%. She established relationships with buyers in 2 more territories, giving them better market access. She turned the ranch's finances from merely stable to actually profitable. And slowly, almost despite himself, Colton started treating her less like an intruder and more like the partner she'd demanded to be. He asked her opinion on where to move the herd for spring grazing. He consulted her about hiring additional ranch hands. He even, and this felt monumental to both of them, gave her the combination to the safe where he kept important documents and cash reserves. "You're sure about this?" Vivian asked when he handed her the numbers scrawled on paper. "No, but I'm doing it anyway." He met her eyes. "You were right about the partnership thing. About needing to trust each other. Figured I should start actually doing it." It was perhaps the most honest thing he'd ever said to her, and Vivian felt something warm unfold in her chest that had nothing to do with attraction and everything to do with respect. "Thank you," she said. "I know what this cost you." "Yeah, well, don't make me regret it." "I'll do my best." But the peace couldn't last forever. It ended on a Thursday afternoon when Jack came riding in hard from the northern pasture, his horse lathered and his face grim. "They've got Miguel," he said, barely waiting until his horse stopped. "The spring, 4 men. They were waiting." Colton's blood went ice cold. "Is he alive?" "Don't know. They had him on the ground when I saw them, but I couldn't get close enough to help. Came to get reinforcements." Jack was already dismounting, checking his weapons. "They're still there, probably waiting for us." "It's a trap." Vivian appeared from the house, already armed. "They took Miguel to draw us out." "I know it's a trap." Colton checked his rifle, his movements sharp and controlled. "Doesn't change anything. We're not leaving him there." "Agreed, but we do this smart." She grabbed paper and pencil, sketching quickly. "The spring is surrounded by rocks on 3 sides. They'll expect us to come straight up the main path. So we split up, 2 groups, flank from the north and south, catch them between us. That leaves them in the middle with Miguel." and gives us the high ground an element of surprise. Vivian looked up. It's the best chance we have, unless you've got a better plan. Colton didn't. He hated it. Hated the risk. Hated that they were walking into exactly what those men wanted. But she was right. A direct assault would get them all killed. Jack and Danny take north. Vivian and I take south. He checked his pistol, made sure the cylinder was full. Nobody shoots unless I give the signal. We get Miguel out first, worry about revenge second. They rode out fast, splitting at the fork that led to the Henderson property. Colton pushed his horse hard, Vivian matching him stride for stride. The afternoon sun beat down mercilessly, and sweat stung his eyes, but he barely noticed. Miguel was family. Maybe not blood, but family nonetheless. The kind you chose instead of being born into. And Colton would burn the whole territory down before he let those men hurt him. They reached the south approach to the spring and dismounted, moving the rest of the way on foot. Through the rocks, Colton could see the spring below, and 4 men standing around Miguel, who was on his knees with his hands bound behind his back. One of them was the scarred leader. The others were men Colton had seen around town, drifters and troublemakers who hired out for violence when the price was right. "Last chance to reconsider," the scarred man was saying, his voice carrying up through the rocks. "You tell Mercer to sell that land or things get a lot worse for everyone." Miguel spat blood onto the ground. "Go to hell." The man hit him, a casual backhand that sent Miguel sprawling. Colton's finger tightened on the trigger, but Vivian's hand on his arm stopped him. "Wait," she whispered. "Jack and Danny aren't in position yet." Every second felt like an hour. Colton watched the men below, memorizing their positions, planning his shots. First the one on the left, then the scarred leader, then movement on the northern rocks. Jack and Danny, finally in position. Jack caught Colton's eye and nodded. Colton stood up, rifle raised. "Let him go." Forehead snapped up. The scarred man smiled like this was exactly what he'd been hoping for. "Well, that was faster than expected. You always this predictable, Mercer? You're surrounded. Jack and Danny have you from the north. Vivian and I have you from the south. Let Miguel go and ride out, and nobody has to die today." "Surrounded?" The man laughed. "You brought your wife to a gunfight? That's—" Vivian fired. The bullet kicked up dust 6 inches from the man's boot. Not a miss, Colton realized, but a warning. A demonstration that she could hit what she aimed at. "Next one goes in your knee," she called down, her voice steady as stone. "Then the other knee. Then we see how brave you are when you can't walk. Your choice." The smile fell off the scarred man's face. For the first time, Colton saw uncertainty there. This wasn't going the way he'd planned. He'd expected Colton to come in raging and sloppy, expected to provoke a shootout they could win through numbers and position. He hadn't expected strategy, hadn't expected Vivian. "You're bluffing," he said, but his voice lacked conviction. "I really don't bluff." Vivian's rifle didn't waver. "You have 10 seconds, same as last time. I'd suggest you use them wisely." The man looked at his companions, saw the same uncertainty reflected there. They were hired guns, not fanatics. This job wasn't worth dying for. "Cut him loose," he ordered finally. One of the men cut Miguel's bonds. Miguel scrambled away, half running, half falling toward the southern rocks, where Colton and Vivian waited. Colton grabbed him, pulling him into cover. "You all right?" "Been better." Miguel's face was bruised, one eye swelling shut. They were waiting, knew exactly when I'd be there. "We'll worry about that later." Colton turned back to the men below, who were already moving toward their horses. "This is your only warning. Come onto my land again, threaten my people again, and I won't be as merciful. Understood?" The scarred man paused, one hand on his saddle. "This ain't over, Mercer. Not by a long shot." "Yes, it is. You just don't know it yet." They rode off, and Colton let them go despite every instinct screaming to finish this permanently. But Vivian was right. Killing them would only bring more trouble. Better to let them leave and hope they were smart enough to stay gone. The ride back was quiet. Miguel slumped in his saddle, clearly in pain but refusing to complain. When they reached the ranch, Vivian immediately started tending his injuries while Colton gathered everyone in the main room. "We've got a problem," he said without preamble. They knew Miguel would be at the spring today, knew his patrol schedule. Jack's face darkened. "You saying we got a spy?" "I'm saying someone told them where to wait." Colton looked at each of them. Danny, Jack, the two seasonal hands they'd hired last month. And I need to know who. Silence fell, heavy and accusing. Colton watched their faces, looking for guilt, for fear, for any sign of betrayal. But everyone just looked shocked and angry. Boss, I've been with you 5 years, Jack said finally. You really think I don't want to think any of you would. But Miguel's sitting in there with a face that looks like raw meat because someone sold us out. Colton's voice went hard. So I'm asking once and I'm asking nice. Anyone got something to tell me? More silence. Then one of the seasonal hands, a young guy named Pete, who'd only been with them 6 weeks, cleared his throat. I might have mentioned some things. In town. At the saloon. His face flushed red. Didn't think nothing of it. Just talking about work, you know. The rotation schedule came up, but I wasn't trying to get out. Colton's voice came out deadly quiet. Boss, please, I didn't mean get your things and get off my property. Now, before I do something we'll both regret. Pete scrambled out, and the other seasonal hand, a man named Ross, followed without being told. Colton watched them go, then turned to the remaining men. Anyone else got loose lips I should know about? Head shakes all around. Good. Because from now on, nothing about our operations leaves this ranch. Not schedules, not finances, not plans, nothing. We trust each other or we trust nobody. Clear? Clear, they echoed. After they dispersed, Colton slumped into a chair, suddenly exhausted. Vivian emerged from the back room where she'd been patching Miguel up. He'll be fine. Nothing broken, just bruised. She sat down across from him. You handled that well. Did I? I just fired 2 men and might have lost Miguel because I wasn't careful enough about who I hired. You learned there's a cost to trust. That's not the same as being careless. She leaned forward. Listen to me. This isn't your fault. Those men made their choices. All you can do is respond and adapt. Like you adapted when your father's partner destroyed everything you built? The words came out harsher than he intended, and he watched Vivian's face close off, walls slamming back into place. That was different, she said coolly. Was it? Or are we both just trying to control everything because the alternative is admitting we can't protect what matters? Vivian stood abruptly. I'm going to check on Miguel. She walked out, leaving Colton alone with his anger and his fear and the growing realization that he was falling for her. The thought hit him like a physical blow. Somewhere between the arguments and the partnership and the late nights planning how to survive, he'd started caring about Vivian as more than just a legal arrangement. Started noticing the way she moved, the sharpness of her mind, the courage that never quit even when any sane person would have run. And that terrified him more than any threat those men could make. Because caring meant vulnerability, meant trusting someone with the parts of yourself that could be broken, meant risking the one thing he'd spent 10 years protecting, his heart. Colton sat there in the empty room, staring at the walls he'd built with his own hands, and realized they weren't protecting him anymore. They were just keeping him alone. The realization didn't make anything easier. If anything, it made everything worse. Colton spent the next 3 days avoiding Vivian as much as 2 people living in the same house and running the same ranch possibly could. He took the dawn patrols, the late-night checks, any task that kept him away from the house and away from conversations that might force him to confront what he was feeling. Vivian, for her part, seemed content with the distance. Or maybe she was just as confused as he was. Either way, they moved around each other like dancers who'd forgotten the steps, maintaining careful space where before there'd been easy partnership. Miguel noticed first. He cornered Colton in the barn on the 4th day, his face still bruised but healing. You and Mrs. Mercer fighting? No. Then why are you acting like a dog that got kicked? Miguel leaned against the stall door, arms crossed. You've been miserable for days. She's been miserable for days. Something happened. Nothing happened. We're fine. Boss, I got beat up saving this ranch. Least you can do is not lie to me about something obvious. Miguel's voice softened. What's going on? Colton set down the bridle he'd been pretending to repair and finally looked at Miguel directly. I don't know how to do this. Do what? Care about someone. The words felt like admitting defeat. I've spent 10 years making sure I didn't need anyone, making sure nobody could get close enough to hurt me. And now she's here, and she's everything I didn't know I needed, and it's terrifying. Miguel was quiet for a long moment. Then he said, "You know what I learned when I left my family in Mexico and came north?" "What?" "That being alone is easy. It's safe. You can't lose what you don't have." He pushed off from the door. "But it's also a prison, and at some point, you have to decide if safety is worth spending your whole life locked up. What if I let her in and she leaves? What if I trust her and she destroys me like Carson did? Then you hurt for a while, and then you survive because that's what you do." Miguel headed toward the door, then paused. "But what if you don't let her in? What if you spend the rest of your life wondering what could have been? Which one do you think you'll regret more?" He left before Colton could answer, but the question stayed echoing in the silence of the barn. That night, Colton found Vivian in the office, bent over the books by lamplight. She looked tired, more than tired, exhausted in a way that went bone deep. "You should sleep," he said from the doorway. She didn't look up. "So should you." "I came to apologize for what I said about your father's partner. That was out of line." It was honest. Vivian finally met his eyes. "And maybe I needed to hear it. Maybe we're both trying to control things that can't be controlled." Colton stepped into the room, closing the door behind him. "I've been thinking about what you said. About trust. About partnership." "And?" "And you were right. I've been holding back, keeping walls up even after I promised I wouldn't." He moved closer until he was standing on the other side of the desk. "But it's not because I don't trust you. It's because I'm scared of how much I do trust you." Something flickered across Vivian's face. Surprise, maybe, or hope. "Colton, let me finish, please." He took a breath. "When Carson betrayed me, it wasn't just the ranch I lost. It was my ability to believe people could be good, could be honest. For 10 years, I've operated on the assumption that everyone would eventually hurt me if I gave them the chance. And then you showed up, demanding partnership and respect and trust, and you've been proving me wrong every single day." "I don't understand what you're saying." "I'm saying I care about you more than I should, more than I know how to handle." The words came out rough, unpracticed. "And it scares the hell out of me because caring means you could destroy me in ways those men outside never could." Vivian stood slowly, her hands braced on the desk like she needed the support. "You think I don't know that? You think I came out here without understanding what I was risking?" "Then why did you?" "Because I was tired of being afraid." Her voice broke slightly. "Tired of letting fear make all my decisions. You asked me once if I regretted coming here, and I said some days. But the truth is, even on the worst days, even when I'm scared we won't survive what's coming, I don't regret it. Because at least I'm fighting for something real." They stared at each other across the desk. Years of damage and defense mechanisms and carefully constructed walls standing between them like physical barriers. "I don't know how to do this," Colton said quietly. "How to be what you need. I don't need you to be anything except honest. No more running, no more hiding behind work and walls and excuses." Vivian came around the desk until she stood directly in front of him. "Can you do that? Can you stop protecting yourself long enough to actually let me in?" Every instinct Colton had screamed at him to retreat, to deflect, to rebuild the walls before they crumbled completely. But Miguel's words echoed in his head. "Which one will you regret more?" And he realized he already knew the answer. "I can try," he said. "Then try." She kissed him, and Colton felt something fundamental shift in his chest, like a lock finally turning after years of being frozen shut. He pulled her closer, and she came without hesitation. And for the first time since Carson's betrayal, Colton let himself believe that maybe, possibly, he deserved this. When they finally broke apart, both breathing hard, Vivian rested her forehead against his. "We're doing this," she said. It wasn't a question. "Yeah, we are. It's going to be complicated. Everything about us has been complicated from the start." "Fair point." She pulled back enough to look at him properly. "But no more running, no more shutting me out when things get hard. We face everything together or not at all." "Agreed." They stood there in the lamplight, holding each other, and Colton felt the last of his carefully maintained control slip away. It should have terrified him. Instead, it felt like finally being able to breathe after years of holding his breath. The next morning brought unexpected news. A rider arrived from town carrying a telegram, and Colton read it twice before the words made sense. "The Territorial Development Company withdrew their interest in the ranch," he said slowly. Judge Harlan has closed the case. Vivian looked up from breakfast, fork frozen halfway to her mouth. Why? Doesn't say. Just that the matter is resolved and we're clear to continue operating without restrictions. Jack, sitting at the far end of the table, made a skeptical sound. That doesn't make sense. Companies like that don't just give up. No, they don't. Vivian took the telegram, reading it herself. Something changed. Something made them decide we weren't worth the effort. Or someone made them decide, Colton said slowly, pieces clicking together. Those men who've been threatening us. They were working for someone, taking orders from someone with money and influence. The development company. Had to be. And now suddenly both problems disappear at once? He shook his head. No, something else is going on. The answer came 2 days later when Sheriff Morrison rode out to the ranch unannounced. Colton met him in the yard, Vivian at his side, both of them tense and ready for more bad news. Relax, Morrison said, dismounting with the weariness of a man who'd ridden too far. I'm not here to cause trouble. Opposite, actually. Then what are you here for? Vivian asked. To tell you it's over. The Territorial Development Company's lead investor got arrested in Denver on fraud charges. Turns out they've been running schemes like this across 3 territories, buying up land through legal pressure, then selling it for profit. Federal marshals have been investigating for months. Colton felt something unclench in his chest. And the men who attacked us? Scattered. Without pay coming in, they moved on to easier targets. Morrison's face hardened slightly. For what it's worth, I knew something wasn't right about this whole situation. But I've got a family to feed, and making waves against powerful men isn't conducive to keeping my job. So you let them try to destroy us because it was convenient, Vivian said coldly. I followed the law as it was written, nothing more, nothing less. Morrison climbed back on his horse. But yeah, I could have done more, should have done more. That's something I'll have to live with. He rode off, leaving Colton and Vivian standing in the yard, trying to process that the threat they'd been living under for months had just evaporated. It's really over, Vivian said finally. Seems like it. They looked at each other and then Vivian started laughing. Not happy laughter, but the slightly hysterical kind that comes from tension finally breaking. We survived, she said. Against all odds and common sense, we actually survived. Colton pulled her into his arms, and she came willingly, burying her face in his shoulder. He could feel her shaking, from laughter or relief or delayed fear, he wasn't sure. Maybe all 3. We did, he said quietly. Together. The word felt important, final, like a promise made and kept. The ranch settled into something resembling normalcy after that. Without the constant threat of attack, they could focus on actually building instead of just defending. The Henderson land was integrated fully into the operation. They hired 3 new ranch hands to replace the ones they'd lost, carefully this time, with background checks and references. And Colton and Vivian learned how to be married. Actually married, not just legal partners sharing space. It wasn't smooth. They still argued about money, about priorities, about the right way to handle problems. Vivian still pushed too hard sometimes, demanding more openness than Colton knew how to give. Colton still retreated into silence when emotions got too big to handle, leaving Vivian frustrated and hurt. But they worked at it, slowly, imperfectly, learning each other's patterns and triggers and the shape of each other's damage. Tell me about your parents, Vivian said one night, lying beside him in the darkness. Not much to tell. They were good people, died too young. Colton. What? That's not telling me, that's summarizing. She rolled onto her side to face him. You promised no more walls. He stared at the ceiling, wrestling with the instinct to deflect. Then he took a breath and tried. My father was a farmer, worked land that didn't want to be worked. We were poor, not just regular poor, but the kind where you eat every other day and pray nothing breaks because you can't afford to fix it. The words came slowly, rusty with disuse. He tried so hard, worked himself into the ground, literally trying to make that land produce. And when the fever came, he didn't have the strength left to fight it. And your mother? Gave up after he died. Just stopped trying. Within 6 months, she was gone too. Colton's throat tightened. I was 15. Watched both of them die knowing there was nothing I could do to save them. That feeling of helplessness, of failing the people who needed me most, that's what I've been running from ever since. Vivian's hand found his in the darkness, squeezing gently. You were a child. It wasn't your responsibility to save them. Doesn't change how it felt. No. But maybe it explains why you fight so hard to control everything now, why you push people away before they can need you. She was quiet for a moment. My father died alone. Heart attack in his office. I was in a meeting across town arguing about something that seemed important at the time. By the time I got there, he was already gone. That wasn't your fault either. No, but I spent the next 2 years punishing myself for it anyway, thinking if I'd just been there, if I just paid more attention, I could have done something. Her voice cracked. And then when his partner took everything, when I lost the business we'd built together, it felt like losing him all over again. They lay there in the darkness, two people carrying more weight than anyone should have to carry alone, finally sharing the burden. We're kind of a mess, Colton said finally. Completely. Vivian moved closer, resting her head on his shoulder. But we're a mess together. That has to count for something. It counted for more than Colton had words to express. Spring turned to summer, and the ranch thrived. Cattle prices stayed high. The new land proved even more valuable than they'd anticipated. Word spread through the territory about the ranch that had fought off corporate greed and won. And other small landowners started seeking Vivian's advice about protecting their own properties. She started spending 2 days a week in town, helping people navigate legal documents and contracts, building a reputation as someone who understood both business and justice. Colton watched her come alive in ways he hadn't seen before, using skills she'd honed back east to help people who needed it. You're good at this, he said one evening after she'd spent the afternoon helping a widow negotiate fair prices for her late husband's mining claim. It feels good, useful. Vivian stretched, tired but satisfied. Back in Boston, I used these skills to make rich men richer. Out here, I can actually help people who need it. You ever miss it, the city? Sometimes. I miss theater, good restaurants, bookstores. She smiled. But I don't miss the person I was there. That version of me was so focused on proving herself that she forgot what actually mattered. Which is building something real. With someone who sees you for who you actually are, not who they want you to be. She looked at him. You see me, Colton, even the parts I tried to hide. That's worth more than all the theaters and bookstores in Boston. He kissed her then, deep and slow, trying to pour everything he couldn't say into the gesture. When they broke apart, she was smiling. We should go to town tomorrow, she said. Together. Let people see us as an actual couple instead of a business arrangement. The suggestion made Colton uncomfortable in ways he couldn't quite articulate. Going to town together, being openly affectionate, acknowledging their relationship publicly, it felt like inviting scrutiny, inviting judgment. Why does it matter what people think? He asked. Because we live in a community, whether you like it or not, and communities function on relationships and reputation. She cupped his face. I'm not asking you to perform, just to stop hiding what we have like it's something to be ashamed of. I'm not ashamed. Then prove it. So they went to town, walked down the main street together, stopped at the general store where Mrs. Patterson eyed them with barely concealed curiosity, had lunch at the hotel restaurant where half the town could see them sitting together, talking and laughing like they actually enjoyed each other's company. It felt strange, exposing, but also strangely liberating. On the ride home, Vivian said, "That wasn't so bad, was it?" "It was fine." "Just fine?" "It was good," Colton admitted. "Strange, but good. We could make it a regular thing. Once a week, come to town together. Be part of the community instead of isolated from it." The idea still made him uncomfortable, but Colton was learning that discomfort wasn't always a sign of danger. Sometimes it was just growth. All right, once a week. Vivian's smile was bright enough to hurt. But summer also brought new challenges. A drought hit the territory hard, drying up smaller water sources and forcing ranchers into competition for what remained. The Henderson Spring became even more valuable, and with it, a source of potential conflict. A neighboring rancher named Blackwood approached them about buying water rights. He was polite enough, but his offer was insultingly low. "He's testing us," Vivian said after Blackwood left, "seeing if we're desperate enough to sell. We're not selling. I know, but he doesn't know that yet, which means he'll be back with a higher offer. And when we refuse that one, he'll try something else. You think he'll cause trouble? I think desperate men do desperate things. She looked out at the parched landscape. We need to be careful. Her instincts proved correct 2 weeks later when cattle on the northern edge of their property started getting sick. Miguel brought the news, his face grim. Something's wrong with the water up there. 3 head dead, 5 more showing symptoms. Colton rode out immediately to investigate. What he found made his blood boil. Someone had deliberately contaminated the northern creek, dumping something toxic upstream where it would flow onto Iron Ridge land. Blackwood, he said when he got back to the house. You're sure? His property is upstream, and this happened right after we refused his offer. Colton paced the office, fury building. He's trying to force us to use the Henderson Spring exclusively, drain it faster, make us vulnerable. So we report it to the sheriff. And he does nothing, just like before. Colton slammed his fist on the desk. I'm done playing by rules that only apply to us. Don't. Vivian stood, moving to block his path. Don't do something reckless because you're angry. He killed our cattle. I know, and we'll handle it, but not by riding over there and starting a war. Her eyes were fierce. We're smarter than that. Better than that. Then what do you suggest? We prove it was him. Document everything. Build a case so airtight he can't wriggle out of it. She grabbed paper and pencil. Then we don't just go to the sheriff. We go to the territorial governor. Make this big enough that it can't be ignored. It took 3 days of careful investigation, but they found the evidence. Empty barrels with chemical residue hidden on Blackwood's property, matching the contamination in the creek. Testimony from one of Blackwood's own hands who'd been uncomfortable with the plan and was willing to talk. Armed with everything they needed, they rode to the territorial capital. The governor was a thin man with sharp eyes who listened to their case without interrupting. When they finished, he studied the evidence for a long moment. This is serious, he said finally. Intentional contamination of water sources affects everyone in the territory, not just your ranch. Which is why we brought it to you instead of handling it ourselves, Vivian said. We're asking for legal intervention before this escalates into violence. The governor nodded slowly. I'll send territorial marshals to investigate. If the evidence supports your claims, Blackwood will face criminal charges. He looked at Colton. You understand this might make you unpopular with some of the other ranchers. They'll see this as you using government intervention against one of their own. Let them, Colton said. I'm tired of living in a place where doing the right thing makes you the enemy. The investigation moved quickly. Blackwood was arrested within a week, his ranch placed under temporary oversight while the case proceeded. Other ranchers grumbled about government overreach, but nobody could deny the evidence. And Iron Ridge Ranch's reputation grew, not just as survivors, but as people who fought corruption wherever they found it. We're making enemies, Colton said one night, watching the sunset from the porch. We're making examples, Vivian corrected, showing people there's another way to do things, that you don't have to accept corruption and violence as the cost of frontier life. You really believe that? I have to, because if I stop believing things can be better, then what's the point of any of this? Colton pulled her close, and she leaned into him, and they stood there watching the light fade from the sky. The ranch spread out before them, larger now, more prosperous, more secure than it had ever been. But more than that, it felt like home in a way it never had when Colton lived here alone. Fall arrived with cooler temperatures and the endless work of preparing for winter. They needed to repair buildings, stock supplies, make sure everything was ready for the harsh months ahead. But this year felt different. This year, Colton wasn't preparing to survive winter alone. He was preparing to face it with someone who'd chosen to stay, who'd fought beside him, who'd proven over and over that she wasn't going anywhere. One evening in late October, sitting by the fire after a long day, Vivian said, I've been thinking about next spring. What about it? We should hire more people, expand the operation further, maybe start breeding horses in addition to cattle. That's a lot of growth. We can handle it. She looked at him. Unless you want to keep things small and manageable. Colton thought about it. A year ago, his answer would have been immediate. Keep things small, stay in control, don't risk expanding beyond what he could personally oversee. But now, with Vivian beside him, the idea of growing didn't feel like losing control. It felt like building a future. Let's do it, he said. All of it. Her smile was everything. But as fall deepened toward winter, Colton noticed something changing in Vivian. She was tired more often, quiet in ways that didn't match her usual sharp energy. He caught her being sick one morning and tried to ask about it, but she deflected. Just a stomach bug. I'm fine. But she wasn't fine, and they both knew it. A week later, she finally told him the truth. I'm pregnant. The words hung in the air between them, enormous and terrifying and wonderful all at once. Colton stared at her, his mind racing through implications and fears, and a joy so profound it scared him. You're sure? Pretty sure. All the signs are there. She watched his face carefully. Say something. I don't know what to say. He reached for her hand. Do you want this? I don't know. I hadn't planned on it, hadn't really thought about children. Her voice wavered. But now that it's real, now that it's happening, yes, I want this, if you do. Colton thought about his own childhood, about poverty and loss and the helpless feeling of watching his parents die, about all the ways he'd promised himself he'd never bring children into a world that could be so cruel. But he also thought about the ranch they'd built, about partnership and trust and facing fear together, about Vivian's fierce determination and his own hard-won strength. Maybe their child would have a better chance than either of them had. Yeah, he said finally, pulling her close. I want this. They held each other in the fading afternoon light, two people who'd survived more than most, preparing to bring new life into the hard, beautiful world they'd fought to claim. Winter came hard that year, rolling across the territory like a physical force. By December, the temperatures had dropped below anything Colton had seen in his 10 years on the ranch, and the first real snow hit 2 weeks before Christmas. Vivian's pregnancy progressed through those cold months with the determination that matched everything else about her. She refused to slow down despite Colton's constant worry, insisting she could still ride, still work, still manage the books, and help plan the spring expansion. I'm pregnant, not dying, she said after he tried to stop her from going out to check the cattle in a snowstorm. Women have been doing this since the beginning of time. Not my women, not carrying my child. She softened at that, touching his face. I'll be careful. I promise. But I need you to trust that I know my own limits. Trusting was still hard, especially when every protective instinct he'd developed over a lifetime of survival screamed at him to keep her close, keep her safe, keep her from any possible danger. But Colton was learning, slowly, painfully, that love wasn't about control. It was about trusting someone enough to let them make their own choices, even when those choices scared you. So he let her ride out, but he rode with her. And when she finally admitted she was too tired to make the full patrol, he didn't say, I told you so. He just turned them back toward home and held her hand the whole way. The baby was due in late spring, and they spent the winter preparing in ways neither of them fully understood. Vivian read every book on childbirth she could find, making lists and plans with her typical precision. Colton built a cradle from oak wood, working on it late at night when he couldn't sleep, pouring all his wordless fear and hope into every careful joint and smooth surface. It's beautiful, Vivian said when he finally showed it to her. She ran her hand over the polished wood, and Colton saw tears in her eyes. Our baby is going to be so loved. Yeah, they are. But as winter deepened, Colton felt something else growing alongside his anticipation, a fear so profound it sometimes woke him in the middle of the night, gasping, fear that something would go wrong, that he'd lose Vivian the way he'd lost his mother, that he'd fail to protect the people who mattered most. He tried to hide it, but Vivian knew him too well now. Talk to me, she said one night when she found him standing at the window, staring out at the snow-covered landscape. Whatever you're thinking, it's eating you alive. I'm scared, he admitted, that something will happen to you, to the baby, that I won't be able to protect you when it matters most. You can't protect me from everything, Colton. Life doesn't work that way. I know. But that doesn't stop me from wanting to. He turned to face her. When my mother died, I was helpless. Couldn't do anything except watch. And the thought of going through that again with you. You won't. Vivian crossed to him, taking his hands. I'm strong, healthy, and we've got the best doctor in the territory on standby. But even if something does go wrong, you hiding your fear doesn't protect me. It just makes you suffer alone. I don't want to burden you with it. That's not how this works. We carry each other's burdens. That's the whole point of partnership. She pulled him close. Tell me when you're scared. Let me help. That's what I'm here for. So he started telling her about the nightmares, about the memories of his mother growing weaker, about the terror of loving someone enough that losing them would break him completely. And Vivian listened without trying to fix it or make it better, just holding him while he finally let himself feel everything he'd been suppressing. "I love you," he said one night, the words still unfamiliar but getting easier each time. "I know I don't say it enough, but I do. More than I thought I was capable of." "I love you too." She smiled against his shoulder. "Even when you're stubborn and overprotective and terrible at expressing emotions." "I'm working on that." "I know. And I appreciate the effort, even when it's messy." January brought a blizzard that lasted 3 days, trapping them inside the house with Miguel, Jack, and Danny. They played cards, told stories, and generally drove each other half crazy with proximity. But there was also something comforting about it, being snowed in with people who'd become family, surviving the storm together. On the third night, with wind howling outside and the fire burning low, Jack started talking about his own family back in Missouri. Wife and 2 daughters he hadn't seen in 20 years after a fight drove him west. "Biggest regret of my life," he said quietly. "Pride got in the way. Couldn't admit I was wrong, couldn't swallow my stubbornness long enough to go back and fix things. Now they're gone. Wife passed 5 years back, daughters are married with families of their own, and I lost all that time over nothing." The room was silent, except for the wind. Then Miguel spoke up. "I left my family to come north. Told myself it was to find better opportunities, but really I was running from expectations, from the life they'd planned for me." He stared into his coffee cup. "Took me 10 years to realize running from something isn't the same as running towards something. By then, my father had died, and I never got to tell him I understood why he pushed so hard." Danny cleared his throat. "My dad used to say the only thing worse than failing was not trying because you were scared to fail. Wish I'd listened better before he died. Might have saved myself some trouble." They all looked at Colton, waiting. He felt Vivian's hand find his under the table, squeezing gently. "I spent 10 years building walls," he said finally. "Convinced myself that being alone was strength, that needing people made you weak. Then Vivian showed up and proved me wrong about everything." He met her eyes. "Best thing that ever happened to me was being forced to let someone in. Even though I'm difficult and argumentative and refuse to stay in my place?" Vivian asked with a slight smile. "Especially because of that." He raised his coffee cup. "To the people who refuse to let us hide from life." They drank to that, and the storm raged on outside, but inside they were warm and safe and together. February brought a thaw, and with it, more challenges. 2 of the newer ranch hands got into a fight that nearly turned deadly. A section of fence collapsed under snow weight, letting 30 head of cattle wander onto neighboring property. And Vivian's pregnancy reached the point where she finally had to admit she couldn't do everything she used to do. "I hate this," she said, frustrated tears streaming down her face after trying and failing to mount her horse. "I hate feeling useless." "You're not useless. You're growing a human being. That's considerably more important than checking fence lines." "But the ranch will survive." Colton helped her back to the house. "We've got good people. They can handle the day-to-day work. Your job right now is to stay healthy." She wanted to argue. He could see it in her face, but exhaustion won out. She let him guide her inside, let him settle her in the chair by the fire, let him bring her tea and a blanket without complaint. "I don't know how to not be useful," she admitted quietly. "You're useful every moment you exist. The ranch runs better because you organized it. Our finances are solid because you manage them. The entire territory respects us because you fought for what's right." He knelt beside her chair. "And right now, you're doing the most important work of all, making sure our child is healthy and safe. That's not useless. That's everything." She cried then, really cried, and Colton held her while she released months of pressure and fear and the overwhelming weight of trying to prove she belonged here. When she finally quieted, she said, "I'm scared too, about the birth, about being a mother, about all the ways I could fail. Then we'll be scared together, and we'll figure it out together, same way we figured out everything else." "Promise?" "Promise." March arrived with cautious warmth and the first signs of spring. The cattle started moving to higher pastures. New foals appeared in the paddock, wobbly-legged and curious. And Iron Ridge Ranch prepared for another season of growth and work. But Colton's attention was elsewhere. He watched Vivian constantly now, monitoring every wince, every tired sigh, every moment of discomfort. The doctor had been out twice to check on her, declaring everything normal and healthy. But normal didn't ease Colton's fear. Then one night in mid-April, 3 weeks before the baby was due, everything went wrong. Colton woke to Vivian shaking him, her face pale in the moonlight. "Something's wrong," she said. "The baby, it's too early, but something's happening." He was up immediately, pulling on clothes, yelling for Miguel to ride for the doctor. But even as he moved through the motions, fear wrapped around his chest like iron bands. Too early. The baby was coming too early, and that meant danger, meant risk, meant all his worst nightmares crystallizing into reality. The doctor arrived within an hour. Dr. Walsh, a competent woman in her 50s who delivered half the babies in the territory. She examined Vivian quickly while Colton paced outside the bedroom door, listening to sounds he couldn't interpret. Finally, Dr. Walsh emerged. "The baby's coming early, but not dangerously so. 3 weeks isn't ideal, but it's manageable." She looked at Colton's face and her expression softened. "She's strong. The baby's positioned well. This is going to be fine." "You're sure?" "As sure as anyone can be about childbirth. Now stop wearing a hole in my floor and go be with your wife. She needs you." Colton entered the bedroom to find Vivian gripping the bed frame, breathing through a contraction. When it passed, she looked up at him with fear in her eyes. "I'm not ready," she said. "We were supposed to have more time." "Babies don't care about schedules." He took her hand, trying to project a calm he didn't feel. "But Dr. Walsh says everything's progressing normally. We're going to get through this. Together?" "Together." The next 12 hours were the longest of Colton's life. He'd faced down cattle thieves, survived droughts, fought legal battles, and physical ones. But nothing had prepared him for the helplessness of watching Vivian in pain, unable to do anything except hold her hand and try to be strong when he felt like he was breaking apart. She was incredible. Even in agony, even terrified, she fought through each contraction with the same fierce determination she brought to everything else. And slowly, painfully, their child made its way into the world. When the baby finally arrived, a girl, small but healthy, with lungs that proved she'd inherited her mother's refusal to be quiet, Colton felt something fundamental shift inside him. All his carefully constructed defenses, all his fear and walls and determination to never need anyone, crumbled completely. "She's perfect," Vivian whispered, tears streaming down her exhausted face as Dr. Walsh placed the baby in her arms. Colton looked at his daughter, this tiny, impossible person who hadn't existed 12 hours ago, and felt more terrified than he'd ever been in his life. But underneath the terror was something else, something bigger and more powerful than fear. Love. Complete, overwhelming, transformative love. "What should we name her?" Vivian asked. Colton thought about his mother, about loss and memory, and the weight of the past. Then he looked at Vivian, this fierce woman who'd fought her way across the country to find a new life, and knew what felt right. "Sarah," he said, "after my mother," and Rose for her middle name, "after yours." "Sarah Rose Mercer." Vivian smiled through her tears. "Perfect." Dr. Walsh stayed for 2 days, making sure both mother and baby were healthy. By the third day, she declared them both out of danger and extracted promises from Colton that he'd send for her if anything changed. "You did well," she told Vivian before leaving. "Better than most first-time mothers. The baby's lucky to have you." After she left, the ranch settled into a new rhythm. Miguel, Jack, and Danny took over most of the daily operations, giving Colton time to help Vivian with the baby. They fumbled through those first weeks together, exhausted, confused, constantly worried they were doing everything wrong. "She's been crying for an hour," Colton said one night, walking the floor with Sarah while Vivian tried to rest. "I fed her, changed her, checked for anything that might hurt. I don't know what she wants." "She wants you to stop panicking." Vivian appeared in the doorway, looking tired but amused. "Babies can sense fear. Try relaxing." "I don't know how to relax with a screaming infant." "Neither do I. Welcome to parenthood." She took Sarah, and miraculously, the baby quieted. "See? She just wanted her mother." "That's not fair. I was doing everything right." Parenting isn't about doing everything right. It's about being present and trying your best. Vivian settled into the rocking chair. We're going to make mistakes, hundreds of them, but as long as we love her and keep trying, that's enough. Spring progressed, and Sarah grew stronger. By June, she was smiling and starting to recognize faces. By July, she was laughing at Jack's ridiculous faces and grabbing at anything within reach. And Colton fell more in love with both his daughter and his wife with each passing day. But parenthood also brought new conflicts. They argued about discipline, about safety, about the right way to handle a crying baby in the middle of the night. Sometimes those arguments escalated into real fights, both of them exhausted and scared and taking it out on each other. "I'm doing the best I can," Colton snapped after Vivian criticized how he'd put Sarah down for a nap. "I know that, but your best right now is hovering over her like she's made of glass. She needs to learn to self-soothe. She's 4 months old, and you're treating her like she's dying every time she cries." Vivian's voice rose despite her obvious effort to stay calm. "I understand you're scared, but you can't protect her from everything, Colton. You have to let her experience discomfort sometimes, or she'll never learn to handle it. Like you let yourself experience discomfort? You can barely hand her to anyone else without hovering." "That's different." "How?" They glared at each other across the nursery, and Colton realized with sudden clarity that they were both terrified, both trying to protect their daughter in the only ways they knew how, and both convinced the other person was doing it wrong. "We're a mess at this," he said finally. "Complete disaster." Vivian's anger deflated. "We have no idea what we're doing. None whatsoever." They started laughing, and Sarah, sensing the tension had broken, gurgled happily from her cradle. "We need to figure out how to do this better," Vivian said. "How to parent together instead of against each other." "How?" "Same way we figured out everything else. Communication, compromise, being willing to admit when we're wrong." She reached for his hand, "and maybe accepting that there's no perfect way to raise a child, just our way, which will probably be messy and imperfect and full of mistakes. Like everything about us." Exactly like everything about us. They made a pact that night to talk through their fears instead of letting them become fights, to acknowledge when they were projecting their own damage onto their daughter, to trust each other's instincts even when they disagreed with the approach. It didn't solve everything. They still argued, still made mistakes, still had moments of panic and frustration, but they faced those moments together instead of alone, and that made all the difference. By fall, Sarah was crawling, getting into everything, and developing a personality that seemed determined to test every boundary. She had Vivian's fierce determination and Colton's stubborn independence, a combination that promised interesting years ahead. "We're in trouble," Jack said one afternoon, watching Sarah pull herself up on furniture and immediately try to climb higher. "That one's going to be running this ranch by the time she's 10. "If she lives that long," Colton muttered, catching her before she could topple off the chair she'd scaled. But watching his daughter explore the world with fearless curiosity, Colton felt something he'd never expected to feel. Hope. Hope that maybe this next generation could grow up differently, could learn from their parents' mistakes without having to repeat them. That winter, sitting by the fire with Sarah asleep in his arms and Vivian reading beside him, Colton finally understood what he'd been fighting against for so long. It wasn't trust or partnership or even love that had terrified him. It was the vulnerability that came with all of those things. The risk of caring so deeply about someone that losing them would destroy you. But now, holding his daughter and watching his wife, this fierce, complicated woman who'd refused to let him hide from life, he realized something else. Yes, loving people made you vulnerable. Yes, needing them gave them power to hurt you, but isolation didn't protect you from pain. It just guaranteed you'd face it alone. And facing life with people who loved you, that wasn't weakness. It was the only thing that made survival worth the effort. "What are you thinking about?" Vivian asked, looking up from her book. "How wrong I was. About everything." He smiled. "How lucky I am that you refused to accept the walls I'd built. You would have figured it out eventually. Maybe, but it would have taken a lot longer without you forcing the issue." He shifted Sarah slightly, and she made a small sound but didn't wake. "Thank you. For being stubborn enough to not give up on me. Thank you for being brave enough to let me in." Vivian set aside her book and moved closer. "We've built something good here, haven't we?" "Better than good." Colton looked around the room, at the house they'd defended together, the ranch they'd grown together, the family they'd created together. We've built something real, something that matters, something that lasts. Yeah, something that lasts. 5 years passed. Sarah grew from a curious toddler into a confident child who could ride a horse before she could read and had opinions about ranch operations that she wasn't shy about sharing. Two more children followed, a son named James, who had Colton's quiet intensity, and another daughter named Grace, who seemed determined to prove she could do anything her older sister could do, only faster. Iron Ridge Ranch expanded from 1,200 acres to nearly 3,000. They brought in horses alongside the cattle, started breeding programs that drew buyers from across multiple territories. The operation employed 15 full-time hands and twice that many seasonal workers, becoming one of the most successful ranches in Arizona. But more than that, it became a model. Vivian's reputation for fair dealing and strategic thinking drew other ranchers seeking advice. Colton's willingness to stand up to corruption inspired others to fight back against powerful interests trying to steal their land. Together, they proved that running a ranch based on partnership and respect could actually work. The town that had once whispered about the desperate spinster and the isolated rancher now pointed to them as an example of what frontier marriage could be. Not perfect. Everyone knew they still argued, still had conflicts, still struggled with balancing work and family. But real. Built on trust and effort rather than romanticized notions of love. One evening, standing on the porch watching their children chase fireflies in the twilight, Vivian said, "Do you remember what you said when we first met? That marriage was a trap designed to break you." "I was an idiot." "You were scared. There's a difference." She leaned against him. "But you're not scared anymore, are you?" Colton thought about it. Was he still scared? Of course. Every time one of the children got sick, every time a drought threatened the cattle, every time Vivian took on a new challenge that pushed them into uncertain territory, fear was still there. But it didn't control him anymore. Didn't make decisions for him. "I'm still scared," he said honestly. "But now it's the kind of fear that pushes you forward instead of holding you back. The kind that makes you fight harder to protect what matters." "That's the best kind of fear." She turned to face him. "Thank you for not giving up. On the ranch. On us. On yourself. Thank you for not letting me." He kissed her forehead. "For refusing to accept the life I'd resigned myself to." They stood together watching their children play, and Colton thought about the journey that had brought them here. From that first confrontation in the hotel restaurant to this moment of peace, they'd survived threats and challenges that would have broken people who weren't willing to fight for each other. But more than surviving, they'd thrived. They'd built something that would outlast them, not just the physical ranch, but a legacy of courage and partnership that their children would carry forward. Sarah ran up to the porch, dirt-streaked and breathless. "Papa, can we ride out to the Henderson Spring tomorrow? I want to show James and Grace where you and Mama had your big fight with the bad men." Colton laughed. "It wasn't exactly a fight, more of a tense conversation." "Mama says you stood up to 4 armed men because they hurt Miguel." "Well, yes, but your mother was the brave one. She's the one who didn't back down." "You both were brave," Sarah said with the absolute certainty of a 9-year-old. "That's what makes you good partners." After she ran off to rejoin her siblings, Vivian said, "She's right, you know. We're good partners. Better than either of us would have been alone." "I know." Colton pulled her close. "Best decision I never wanted to make was agreeing to marry you. Romantic as ever. You didn't marry me for romance. You married me for partnership." "True. Though the romance turned out to be a pleasant surprise." They stayed on the porch long after the children had been called in for bed, watching stars emerge in the darkening sky. The same stars that had watched over this land when Colton first arrived, young and alone and determined to prove he didn't need anyone. The same stars that had watched him build walls around his heart, convinced that isolation was strength. Those stars had seen everything. His failures and victories, his fear and his growth. The moment a sharp-tongued woman from Boston stepped off a stagecoach and changed his entire life. And now they watched him standing here, no longer alone, no longer afraid to need someone. A man who'd learned the hardest lesson there was, that surviving alone was easy compared to the courage it took to love someone enough to build a life together. "What do you think they'll remember about us?" Vivian asked quietly. "The children. When they're grown and we're gone. I don't know. That we worked hard, probably. That we didn't quit when things got difficult. I hope they remember more than that. She looked at him. I hope they remember that we chose each other every day, even when it was hard, especially when it was hard. They will. Colton felt certain of it in a way he wasn't certain of much. Because that's the truth. That's what all of this was built on. Not the forced marriage or the legal arrangement, but the choice we kept making to stay, to fight, to build something real. Inside, they could hear the children getting ready for bed, their voices carrying through the open windows. Sarah telling James a story about the ranch, Grace demanding one more drink of water, the sounds of a family, messy and imperfect and absolutely real. Come on, Vivian said, taking his hand. Let's go say goodnight to our legacy. They went inside together, and Colton felt something settle in his chest that had been restless for as long as he could remember. This was what mattered. Not the land or the cattle or the success they'd built, but this. People who chose to stay, who chose to love despite risk, who chose to build something that would outlast fear. That night, after the children were finally asleep and the house had settled into quiet, Colton and Vivian stood in the room they now shared, no longer separate, no longer careful about distance. I love you, he said, the words easy now, after years of practice. I don't say it enough, but I do. You say it every day. Vivian smiled. Just not always with words. She was right. He said it every morning when he brought her coffee before she was fully awake. Every evening when he took over with the children so she could have an hour to herself. Every argument where he chose to listen instead of defending. Every moment where he let her see his fear and trust her not to use it against him. Love wasn't just words. It was choice. Action. The daily decision to show up and try, even when trying felt impossible. We did it, Colton said, looking around at the life they'd built. We actually did it. Did what? Survived. Together. He pulled her close. Built something that lasts. We did. She rested her head against his chest. And we'll keep doing it. Tomorrow, and the day after, and every day, until we can't anymore. Promise? Promise. They stood there in the lamplight, two people who'd been broken by life and somehow found a way to put each other back together. Not perfectly. There were still cracks, still scars, still moments where old fears surfaced and had to be fought back down. But stronger than either of them had been alone. Whole in a way that only came from being truly known and loved anyway. Outside, the Arizona night pressed close around Iron Ridge Ranch. The same harsh, beautiful landscape that had tested Colton for 10 years before Vivian arrived. The same unforgiving territory that had demanded everything from both of them. But they'd met that demand, had paid the price and claimed their place, had proven that even on the frontier where survival often meant isolation, it was possible to build something based on trust and partnership and the stubborn refusal to face life alone. And standing there, holding the woman who'd refused to let him hide from love, surrounded by the evidence of the life they'd built together, Colton finally understood what he'd been searching for all those years. Not survival, not safety, not even success. Just this. Someone to stand beside, someone to fight with and for. Someone who saw all your damage and stayed anyway. That was worth more than all the land in the territory. Worth more than all the years of careful isolation. Worth every risk, every fear, every moment of vulnerability that had terrified him. Because at the end of everything, when you stripped away pride and walls and all the defenses people built to protect themselves, what mattered was simple. You loved someone. They loved you back. And together, you built something strong enough to weather whatever came next. That was the legacy. That was what would last. Not the ranch, or the reputation, or the battles they'd won, but the proof that even the most damaged people could learn to trust again, could learn to love again, could learn that needing someone wasn't weakness. It was the only thing that made survival worth the effort. The judge's ultimatum had been meant to break him, to force him into a marriage of convenience that would keep him controllable and small. But instead, it had given him exactly what he'd needed without knowing he needed it. It had given him Vivian, had given him family, had given him a reason to stop just surviving and start actually living. And if that wasn't worth celebrating, nothing was.
Yes. I love blue. Blue and hair is just I mean, just yes, fuck yeah. I love this so much. This is amazing. This detail. Wow. So much good work. So good. All right. Well, we'll keep this pinned at the top of chat if people would like to go check it out and buy some of your artwork. That'd be awesome. Hell yes. Way to go on this. That was so good. Fuck yeah, isn't it? Next level? It really is. So freaking good. Way to go on that. Fantastic work on your on all of it. You have like various fandoms. What's your favorite fandom if you had one, like series or because I noticed like a bunch of sci-fi, mostly fantasy, but yeah, I will be wood burning for 15 years of July. Way to go. The hell yes. I mean, you don't have to narrow it down to one. You could have multiples. I don't want to. I know that's kind of hard. Sometimes it's hard to even just pick one. You do love sci-fi fantasy a lot, yeah, yeah. No, that's awesome. I mean, my favorite. I'm more of a sucker for like sci-fi, like space. That's where I have. I'm a sucker for space sci-fi. Like Star Trek: The Next Generation is one of my favorites. I named my cats after two characters, Geordi LaForge and Guinan. But yeah, that is hella awesome. I love it. No, you did great on all of that. Firefly, yes. Oh, Firefly is amazing. Lord of the Rings, Witcher, Skyrim, and I do love the space stuff a lot, especially space pirates. Okay, nice. Star Trek Voyager. Okay, yes.